Hey everyone, my name's Kelvin and welcome back to another watercolor tutorial for Procreate. So in today's video, I'm going to show you how to make this kind of simple scene like this one. And this is definitely a more advanced tutorial, so I'm going to try not to go into like extreme detail and just try to cover the main important points. But if you're reasonably comfortable with Procreate, I think this project will be just fine. So I'm going to start out with a blank watercolor paper texture in Procreate. And I'm going to use the St. Petersburg texture, but of course any of the textures will work fine. And then for the brushes, I'm going to use the Regular Watercolor Brush Kit, and I'll put links to everything I use in the description down below. Now I've already placed in the sketch as the very top layer, and I've set it to multiply, and that's just so it doesn't cover up what I'm painting underneath the sketch. And you can have this sketch if you want it. I'll put a download link where you can download it for free. But I think this process will work for any kind of illustration like this. So I'm going to start painting by selecting a blank layer underneath the paper texture, just like you normally would. And I'm going to look at the illustration and try to see like how I can break this up. So in this case, I clearly see two different elements. There's the bike and then there's the tree in the background. So I'm going to start with the tree. So I'm going to grab the abstract round brush and just do a quick kind of a wash. So I'm going to choose a kind of light greenish gray color. I think that'll work. And I'm just going to kind of fill out the tree, the trunk, and then this kind of bush in the background. And then after that, I can go in there with the eraser and just kind of fix any of these kind of strokes that didn't work out right. And then if you want, you can use the water blender brush and just kind of mix up some of those overlapping edges just so they're not too overstated. There we go, I think that'll do it. Now the leaves on the tree and the bush, those are both green, but the trunk of the tree is going to be kind of a grayish color. So I want to adjust the background wash in that area with the freehand selection tool. Just like that, I'll select it, hue, saturation, and brightness, and just try to make it a little bit more of a gray tone because it will look better when I actually do the layer on top of it with more details. And I'll start that on another layer. And I'm going to do the palm tree leaves first. So I'll grab a kind of, maybe a slightly more saturated green color, and I'm going to use the abstract round brush, but at a smaller size than I did the background wash. And I'm just going to add some simple details like this. And it's a little bit hard to see, so I'm going to change that layer to multiply. There we go. And just add a bunch of kind of leaf details like this. And that looks pretty good. I think I'll do another layer, but with a kind of a lighter color and see what that looks like. I think it's important just not to get too carried away because it'll end up looking very kind of scribbly. There we go, I think that looks pretty good. And now I can move on and do the trunk real quick. So I'll do that on a different layer. And I'll choose a kind of light gray, maybe a bluish gray color, and just fill that out with the abstract round brush. And I did these kind of side to side strokes just because that's kind of what the palm tree has in real life. And then where I went over the edge, I'll just clean that up with the eraser. I want to see a little bit of that background wash kind of coming through because I just kind of like that effect. And the bush is really simple, and I'll do that on another layer, but I want the bush to stand out from the palm tree. So this kind of color, I'm going to try to choose a different kind of green for that. Yeah, so using a slightly kind of bluer green, I'll fill this one out real quick. And then after that, just to add some detail, I'll choose a lighter version of that green and just drop in a kind of dot pattern like this, just so it has some texture. And that looks pretty good, but I think I want to throw in some kind of really simple foreground elements. So I'm going to use the selection tool, set it to freehand, and I'm just going to try to trace out the kind of shadow of some kind of grass or kind of plants like that. Then I'll go to hue, saturation, and brightness and just darken that area. And it just adds a kind of interesting and easy kind of layer of detail. And here's all my layers at this point. I'm just going to go ahead and merge them all together onto one layer, just so I don't get too carried away with like 20 layers. Then I'm going to do the coconuts on a separate layer. And those are simple. I'm just going to choose a kind of yellowish green color like this. And then using the fine liner pen brush, I'll just fill those out just very roughly like this. And then after that, I'm going to outline them, but the sketch is starting to get in my way, so I'm going to turn that off for now. And then just using a kind of darker version of that green color, I'll just kind of highlight these a little bit. And I don't know why, but a lot of palm trees have these kind of spiky things. I think they're the kind of the old flowers or something, just kind of poking out there, so I'll add those. And maybe just to make this pop a little bit, I'll add a shadow with the freehand selection tool. and just kind of select the bottom edge of each coconut. There we go. Just darken that a little bit. So I want to add some more plants down here behind the bush. So I'm going to make another layer and move it behind everything just so it's at the very bottom there. Then I'm going to select a different green color, something that will stand off from this one. And using the abstract round, at a smaller size, just so I don't have these huge brush strokes, I'm just going to add some simple kind of stroke-based foliage. There we go. I think those look pretty good. And to make them not so uniform, I will make a kind of random selection like this. Feather it out. And I'll try to shift the hue maybe and the brightness. There we go. Just to make it a little more interesting. And they do kind of overlap. Like if I zoom in here, you can see that transparency thing going on. So what I think I'll do is just use the eraser and just kind of clean up the bottoms of them. And then I think as a finishing touch for this part, I'll add some really simple flowers. So I'll make the stem of those a little bit dark, maybe a little bit more yellowish, and I'll use the fine liner pen and just draw those in real quick like that. And then for the flowers themselves, I'm going to do them like a bird of paradise, and that's really easy to make. I'll just select a kind of bright red color like that, and just kind of do these kind of interlocking arc pattern like that. Then I'm going to use the selection tool set to freehand and just make a selection that just circles the bottom part of each flower. Then I'll feather it out a little bit. Then I'm going to go to hue, saturation, and brightness and just shift the hue and kind of introduce some other color in there. There we go. I think that looks pretty good. And again, where these happen to kind of overlap with the bush, like the stem there, I will just kind of erase it just so I don't have that transparent look. And again, I'm just going to kind of merge all the layers I have so far onto one. And I want to add a little bit more variation and lighting to the palm leaves here. So I'm going to use the selection tool set to freehand. Just make a selection that covers one side like this, and I'll feather it out. Then I'll go to hue, saturation, and brightness, and I'll brighten those, saturate them, and then shift them a little bit towards yellow, just so I have the appearance that like sunlight is kind of coming through the leaves. And then maybe down here where we see the trunk, I'll add a shadow at the top and the bottom, just using the freehand selection tool. And this will help bring out a little bit of contrast, but I want to go in there with the water blender and just blur that edge just a little bit. So that's it for the first part of this illustration, and now I can just move on and do the bike. And the bike is really simple. What I'm going to do though is turn on the sketch and then turn off the artwork that I've done so far, just because it's a little bit distracting, and I'll do the bike on a different layer. And just using the fine liner pen, I'm just going to fill out the bike real quick. And for the tires, I'm going to use a kind of medium gray color. I definitely don't want it to be similar to the bike frame, and I'll just do these wheel rims real quick. Just keep in mind that there is a place where they kind of overlap and underlap. So here I'm just going to create just kind of break in that line, just so it looks like it's going underneath the frame. And I'll do the same thing over here. And then using just a couple different colors, I'm going to fill out the gear, the pedals, and the seat. So that's it for the bike, just the basic layout of the bike. And I did manage to do that on just one layer, but if you need to use a few layers, it's totally fine. Now I'm going to turn off the sketch, and I'm just going to make a random selection using the freehand selection tool just over this bike, just because it's looking a little bit flat. And I will feather out that selection. I'm going to go to hue, saturation, and brightness, and just brighten it and desaturate it, and maybe shift the hue just a tiny bit. Then I'm going to do it again, but I'm going to make a kind of harder selection. I will feather it out still, but just a little bit this time. And I'm going to do basically the same thing, except I'll slightly darken it, slightly desaturate it again, and just leave it like that. Now I can go ahead and turn everything on. And this is looking pretty good, but we have kind of a contrast issue with the bike kind of in front of that bush. And there's a really cool way that I like to solve that. So what I'm going to do is open the layers panel here, and you'll notice the bike is on top, and that bush is kind of behind it. What I'm going to do is select the bush and make a layer that's between the bike and the bush there. Then I'm going to select pure white. Or actually, it's going to be a slightly bluish kind of white, just barely visible. Then I'm going to use the fine liner pen. And now because I'm underneath the bike but above the tree, I can sort of create an empty space that exactly fits the bike. And I'm kind of making it overlap on purpose because I just want to see that kind of contrast line, just to make the bike kind of jump out a little bit more. And because this is a very light blue color, I can still see it out here. So I'm going to continue that kind of underline or outline over the rest of the bike, even though it's not in front of the bush. And as a finishing touch here, I'm just going to merge everything together and make a new layer and just add a couple of kind of random miscellaneous details just on the front. And there we go, this one is all done, and I really love the way it printed out. Now, when I was sort of planning this illustration and making the original sketch, I discovered a few things. One of them is the sketch is probably one of the hardest parts of this. So don't be afraid to redo the sketch a few times, with your own unique scene. And sometimes scenes, they just don't work out. But for me, it probably took 3 or 4 sketches just to get this even close to being right. And then as far as painting it in goes, I think the struggle there is going to be the confidence to finish it. So what I do to help me through that is I just commit myself to painting it from beginning to end, and I know it's going to suck because it's the first time I painted this scene. But maybe the second or the third time is better, and I try to keep track of certain parts of it that I like, certain parts that I don't like with my kind of previous iterations. And then maybe the third, even the fourth time that I paint it, it really comes together and it's exactly how I want. And that pretty much wraps it up. But as always, thank you so much for your support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.